Our next speaker is myself. I'm Mary Glowacki, and my presentation is entitled Archaeology of the Appalachian Bay, Societies of Florida's Early Riviera. And before I started, I just wanted to give a shout out to ARI and the other organizations such as Tall Timbers for this great conference. And I'm very honored to have been brought into the fold, and I thank you for this opportunity to share a little bit of our Florida history this morning. So the Apalachee Bay has supported early peoples of the Northwest Florida coastline and its adjoining riverways for millennia. This area was an active corridor for the first inhabitants of the peninsula, a rich and thriving habitat for later sedentary communities along the banks of the Wakulla, St. Marks, Wassissa, and Osceola rivers, and an important trade route for historic Anglo settlers and entrepreneurs well into the 20th century. And this talk highlights just some of the many human events recorded through archaeology that characterize this portion of the Gulf Coast, as well as acknowledging conservation efforts and programs for protecting these fragile resources. Oops. When the word Riviera is mentioned, most people think of the coast of France and luxury vacation spots of the rich and famous, or in the case of us Floridians, the beaches of Panama City, affectionately known as the Redneck Riviera, popular spring break venue. But Riviera is really just a coastal region with a semi-tropical climate and vegetation, even if only seasonal, and we have many here in Florida. And my focus today is the region associated with the Apalachee Bay, a very significant Riviera, or at least an important hub of human coastal activity in the prehistory and history of Florida. So, what are the qualities of the Apalachee Bay that made it conducive to early human habitation? As you see through time, many factors contributed depending on the period, and narrow regional purviews must be set aside to understand these factors. And this has been a constant theme through our conference regarding sea level rise, temperature changes, changes in flora and fauna. This may be a little redundant considering the many topics that have been discussed previously, but evidence for the earliest inhabitants of Florida, and for that matter, North America, is found in the Appalachian Bay region, dating to the late Pleistocene period, roughly 15,000 to 9,000 BP. Though hardly a tropical paradise at the time, the Florida Peninsula was much larger than today, with its Gulf shoreline extending 100 miles further south out of the Apalachee Bay. Paleo-Indian sites, now inundated, have been recorded on the Suwannee River to the east and the Osceola River, the latter flowing into the Apalachee Bay, as well as in the bay along the Relic River channel. Permanent water sources associated with sink springs provided a strong incentive to occupy this region, and this map shows some of the more important recognized sites of this time period. The Osceola River has one of the densest known concentrations of Paleo-Indian sites in North America. Page Ladson is the oldest securely radiocarbon dated site, as early as calibrated 15,000 BP, with unquestionable artifacts of the first Americans with stratigraphic integrity. Additionally, it contains a pre-Clovis component associated with workstone tools. At Page Ladson, Hunter-gatherers, possibly accompanied by dogs, butchered or scavenged a mastodon carcass at the sinkhole's edge next to a pond. These people had successfully adapted to their environment. They knew where to find fresh water, game, plants, raw materials for making tools, and other critical resources for survival. Also on the Oscilla, the Sloth Hole site, dating to approximately the same age, generated mastodon bone with butchering marks, flaked mastodon bone tools, carved ivory shafts, and clovis points. On a tributary, the Wassissa River, the Alexan Bison site yields bones of an extinct bison with a broken point that perforates its skull, dating to calibrated 12,000 BC, and that was discussed yesterday. And along the ancient Oscilla, sites 6 to 9 kilometers offshore and 4 to 6 meters underwater have yielded Paleo-Indian and archaic points and evidence of habitation. The archaic period which follows, so roughly 10,000 to 5,500 BP, shows the adaptation to fluctuating but increasingly warmer environments in modern-day flora and fauna. Sites are found along waterways, stream banks, old meanders or ponds, and higher river terraces. The Appalachian Bay region, as compared to its western counterpart, the Apalachicola Bay, shows a booming population trend, with seasonal and permanent settlements, shelled midden and earthen mounds, and pottery production. Most of the prehistoric canoes found in Florida, and there are several hundred, they date to the Archaic period and indicate a vast network of communities that interacted with one another. And at this time period, we also have evidence for weir fishing in this region. Based on offshore discoveries in the Minnesota area, which is far south of Apalachee Bay on the Midwest Gulf Coast, by the Middle Archaic, large communities flourished. A cemetery dating to approximately 7,000 BP and measuring the size of approximately a football field was recorded less than a half mile from offshore. The burials at the Minnesota Key offshore site resemble those of Windover and Little Salt Spring and a few other sites that date to this time period located in various parts of Florida. But the Minnesota Key offshore site is remarkable in its preservation, as well as its immense area coverage and its sophisticated burial practice of bundling individuals and staking them in a muck pond, and this was a huge, huge muck pond. And I bring this up, we're not in Apalachee Bay, however, there's no reason to think that these same types of burials were not part of archaic life in the Apalachee Bay region, and for that matter, anywhere else in the greater Big Bend. We have never really explored this possibility, and there are substantial areas of wetland that could possibly contain such burials. So where did they bury all of their people?
Hey, Mary, there is, the Acela Bar site is a site like that.
Is it really?
It's on federal land, so nobody can do anything. But it's eroding.
No, you need to discuss that later. Or you want to come up here and?
No.
Okay. I had no idea. Thank you. You are the font of information, as always. During the beginning of the woodland period, so we're now talking about 500 BC to the beginning of AD 1, numerous Midden mound complexes are found located along the lower Wassissa River of the Apalachee Bay drainage. These reflect thriving communities of Deptford culture, exploiting marine, fresh, and brackish water resources. And one example is the Coon Bottom cluster, with sites that range in size from approximately a half acre to an acre. And for this time period, the area is one of the most heavily populated in North Florida and probably the least understood and researched. Jim Dunbar and I have had the opportunity, the pleasure to be able to record this complex while we were at the Florida Bureau of Archaeological Research. And this slide shows a panorama of the site of Coombe Bottom with its substantial relief and area coverage. And there are a few people in this audience who also participated as volunteers in the project, and we really appreciated that. Middle and late woodland sites, so now we're up to 1,000 AD from this region, are associated with what is known as Swift Creek and Weeden Island cultures, highlighted by mounds with impressive mortuary goods and inspiring individuals, early individuals such as Clarence Moore and later Gordon Willey to write their early but seminal Florida publications on North Florida and Gulf Coast archaeology. And this slide to the right shows the classic Swift Creek stamped impressed pottery style. During this time period, in the Apalachee Bay region, sites show a clear connection to South Georgia and particularly to the mound complex known as Kolomoki, which demonstrates a broad inter-regional role. Major sites such as Letchworth Mounds near Monticello, and you can visit it, it's just down the road. A slide to the left, lower left is shown here, as well as the Block Stearns site in Tallahassee support the regions important within this greater sphere. Sadly, a portion of Block Stearns was mitigated ahead of construction of a local middle school, but archaeologist Calvin Jones, who was very formative for Florida archaeology, did an excellent job of recording the Swift Creek component of it, and he is shown here in the upper right slide, both slides from Florida Memory Project. A connection of coastal centers in the greater Big Bend region, of which Apalachee Bay region is central, include two major Weeden Island sites known as Spring Warrior and further south Garden Patch, and extend down further the coastline to Tampa. And Jim and I were also working under the state and were able to record both of these sites, but subsequent research has continued, and they're really amazing. It's just astounding how recent research has demonstrated how significant these sites really are. To the left was what we had plotted as the core and the major mounds and middens. However, very recently, a scholar, Neil Wallace, down in the University of Florida, working with someone at BAR, Paulette McFadden, found that just north on the private property is a whole set of other mounds. So this site is a lot bigger than we ever believed. And to the right, you see just one of the test units that we put in at Garden Patch, showing the superb stratigraphy and preservation of that site. So moving quickly forward, the Mississippian period, which follows. So we're talking about anything after 1,000, 1,200 to the contact period, is recognized in Florida by large mound complexes and satellite sites influenced by chiefdom societies of the Mississippi River drainage. Tallahassee has one of the most prominent sites, the complex of Lake Jackson. And based on artifacts such as this copper breastplate and an artistic rendering of it, excuse me, it demonstrates a clear, wide network that extended not only from the Mississippi Valley, but copper coming from the Great Lakes region. This is Fort Walton culture. There are subsidiary sites that we know of in the actual Apalachee Bay area, and ARI is credited with recording some at Wakulla Springs, which shows the network of these connecting satellite sites to a major center such as Lake Jackson. The Apalachee Bay region is named for the Apalachee Indians, prehistorically known as Fort Walton, whose territory was defined by the region between the Ocklawackee and the Osceola rivers. As farmers, Apalachee predominantly occupied uplands, though coastal sites were essential to tapping Gulf resources. The capital of Apalachee was Untitled, located in Tallahassee, also where the Bureau of Archaeological Research is located. And it was also the location of Hernando de Soto's winter encampment. The Spanish who reached Untitled in 1539 waited there for supply ships to arrive in the port of St. Mark's, leading out to the Apalachee Bay. This conduit from the coast upriver to the interior clearly held much greater antiquity. And this site was recorded in 1988, also by Calvin Jones. The DeSoto site produced artifacts such as Spanish and Portuguese coins, Spanish majolica, trade beads, and chainmail, as well as Fort Walton artifacts that date to the later period to substantiate an Enhika as the site as Enhika, the capital, as well as the location of the Spanish Appalachee encounter. And this route continued 100 years later with the Spanish mission capital of San Luis. And this is a historic map that documents the connection of the mission to the Apalachee Bay and the St. Mark's port, which they utilize regularly. And then, of course, travel occurred east and west, east to St. Augustine overland. After Spain's initial foray into Florida, the Apalachee Bay played an important role in facilitating Spanish occupation of Pensacola. Between 1679 and 1821, the Spanish fort of St. Mark's, located at the confluence of the Wakulla and St. Mark's rivers, was built 3 times and changed political hands until Florida became an American territory. Its role was to protect trade routes to the interior and west to Pensacola and south to Cuba. Ultimately, Spain lost the fort to the United States in 1818 when Andrew Jackson invaded Florida during the First Seminole War. Shortly afterwards, it was abandoned. And you're looking at, to the left, another Florida memory, Florida State Archives of photographs of the excavations that took place many decades ago. To the right, the foundation that you can visit today. And then these 2 historic maps that show where exactly the fort had been located. In 1861, Confederate soldiers occupied San Marcos, which they renamed Fort Ward. The Confederates built earth fortifications to defend Florida from the Union soldiers who blockaded the St. Mark's River throughout the war. And to your right is a 1862 historic rendering of one of those events. And you can see the lighthouse to the right. During the Civil War period, salt, cotton, ammunition, and other critical goods traveled through the Apalachee Bay region. With the Union blockade, the Confederacy could no longer rely on imported goods and so turned to local production. Along Florida's coastline, many salt works were established. And this is a sketch in the upper left corner of the process that takes place, and one of the iron kettles that were very common in the production use. So along the coastline were established these salt works, and they would use the giant kettles. They would fill them with salt water and then heat them. Salt would evaporate. They would then transport the salt. Salt was really important, particularly with curing meat that could be a good field food for soldiers. And if you're interested, if you're in the area, the St. Mark's Wildlife Refuge has remains of a number of these, and you can walk out a causeway and you can see the remains in clear water when the water's low, the barrels and a few examples of these big cast iron kettles. The Union often raided the coastal salt works, and the Confederacy countered this, creating small independent salt works, and you could actually get out of service by agreeing to produce salt, and that started to create a problem for the Confederacy. People rather would prefer to make salt than actually fight. But many of them were destroyed, and one site is located in the Big Bend, which is east of the Apalachee Bay area, but it eluded discovery and remains undisturbed, and Jim Dunbar will be recording this site in the coming year, with funds from National Park Service's Hurricane Michael grant. So hopefully we'll hear more about that soon. Following the war, we have cattle, we have turpentine, or known as naval stores, fishing, timber, all of which became key industries for the region. While historical accounts record these practices, limited data exists to tie these historical events to actual places, though archaeological surveys have helped to ground truth them. So here we have, again from Florida Memory, some historic images of these activities, and a little bit of archaeology demonstrating the activities. In the lower left, we see a cattle vat. We've recorded a number of these cattle vats to dip them to prevent them from contagious diseases. There's one over in Ball Point. What's really interesting about them is the government implemented this program, and they're very, very standardized. We even found diagrams of how they're to be built, what size they are to be, and how they were used. And then with regard to turpentining, we find in the woods, and have recorded a number of archaeologists, scatters for these camps, and what we find are hurdy cups. There are a number of different types of catchments for turpentine, metal ones, but the hurdy are the classic terracotta ones that you see in the picture in the middle, in the upper middle. And then we also find trees that are carved to hold the catchment, and they're known as cat faces, and you find them all over, and that also helps us identify areas where turpentining was occurring. And then we have many examples. They're rare and somewhat ephemeral, but stakes that would indicate the use of seine fishing, even though it's still practiced today, but is more of a historic style of fishing. And we also find the remains, often ephemeral as well, but of lumber camps. A number of the camps that we've known about historically were disassembled. The bricks were reused by people locally. There's one really good example in the greater Apalachee Bay area. It's farther west in a property called Box R, and it still has structural remains of a smokehouse where they would smoke, treat the wood, where they cut the wood, and then there's a really big cache of saw blades that they left behind. recent Hurricane Michael, 2018, exposed a late 1800s shipwreck known as the Dog Island Shipwreck, also in this general region. And it represents countless ships that have passed through the Apalachee Bay over the years and surrendered to Gulf storms. And this is just but one example of the material evidence of the maritime history of the region that has been documented, but much more that has yet to be documented in the Apalachee Bay. And in this particular case, there's a very good, very interesting report that you can find in the master site file, which was mentioned yesterday. And then during World War II, a lot of people who aren't from this area probably don't realize that the Apalachee Bay region served as a training ground for the European and later Pacific theater. Camp Gordon Johnston opened in 1942 to train infantry divisions and their support units in the amphibious operations by U.S. Army Engineer Special Brigades. And archaeological survey of Tate's Hell State Forest, which is west of here, records numerous examples of some of the weaponry and the staging equipment that they left behind, which is really very interesting. And this is another photo that you can find on the Florida Memory Project. So by the mid-20th century, Florida begins its land conservation efforts. The state of Florida, through legislative funding such as the Conservation and Recreation Lands Program, followed by Florida Forever, which was discussed by Shane yesterday, made unprecedented strides to acquire public land over the decades. And by 1988, it obtained the core properties of approximately 14,000 acres. Other major acquisitions occurred in 2000 and 2003 from the St. Joe Timberland Company. And these are now properties that are being managed by Florida Fish and Wildlife, DEP, Estate Parks, and Forest, by Forestry. And then we need to acknowledge the federally protected land that also maintains and protects many of these resources. Again, St. Mark's Wildlife Refuge to the west, and then even further, the Apalachicola National Forest. Again, management efforts in conjunction with conservation easements, again, discussed by Shane, help to make these connections with private property owners towards legacy land. And I just want to acknowledge again Tall Timbers and the other nonprofit organizations that continue to facilitate this work in protecting environmental and cultural resources. And I mentioned yesterday very briefly that one of my first jobs at BER was to do some survey work for two conservation easements, and they were two of the first that they had, Tall Timbers / Red Hills had handled that were dealt with archaeological sites, and it's just so very exciting after all these years to see so many more properties that are now in conservation easements and that address cultural resources. Despite the cultural preservation efforts, and I'm not trying to be a downer here for the end of my presentation, but I feel it's necessary to discuss that the Apalachee Bay region continues to be plagued by unauthorized digging. The resources face a new generation of looter driven by the high monetary value of early archaeological artifacts like the Clovis, Simpson, Swanee points, projectile points, and many are not collectors that we knew of from the earlier years per se, but participate in a larger black market network associated with drugs, so methamphetamines and all that. And I stress this because many of this region's resources, while amazingly protected in submerged anaerobic environments has been discussed, and in many instances located on statutorily protected lands are nonetheless fragile and non-renewable. To curb this destruction, we benefit from conferences such as this to encourage cultural heritage conservation, and your attendance here is an indication of your support of this preservation, and we thank you for being here today. Thank you. Any questions? Or Jim, would you like to elaborate more on this site that you...
I was thinking it would be more appropriate for you to tell us a little bit about the Hurricane Michael grants in Taylor County coming up.
Well, and you can jump in, just keep holding the microphone. ARI received two major grants under Hurricane Michael relief funds that came from the National Park Service. This is really huge. Unfortunately, the state will manage the funding, and I guess COVID and some other reasons have dragged out the process, but fortunately for ARI, they finally were able to execute the agreements, and they'll begin work very shortly. One project is back at Wakulla, and I think Willard Boyer, who's here today, he would be the best person to talk to about what work he plans to conduct there. But Jim is going to be, well, he's technically the PI for 3 sites in the Big Bend. So this is going to be east of Apalachee Bay. Jim picked, there was very specific criteria for this funding. It had to be money used to record sites that were eligible for the National Register or already on the National Register that had been negatively impacted by Hurricane Michael. And Jim and I, having spent a lot of time in the Big Bend working on fish and wildlife properties, identified 3 sites that we knew were low-hanging fruit. They were perfect for the project. One is the one that I mentioned earlier, that it is an untouched, we think a pristine salt works, which is pretty amazing. The second is one that Jim identified through the use of LIDAR, and it's the Florida site.
It's a Florida Mound and Midden site.
Right, but that's the name that we called it, you called it the Florida Mound site?
Yeah.
Okay, it is a mound that, because of its location, if you know the Big Bend area, it's really difficult to navigate. It's tucked away in a very swampy area, but it is also pristine. It's never been looted, it's never been studied, and so that's the second one. There was just a lot of tree fall and erosion due to the storm. And then the third is we're going back to Spring Warrior, which I discussed earlier, because there was a lot of damage there, and we're going to help with Neil Wallace's work in trying to record some of those sites that, in order to create a National Register nomination, and Spring Warrior is not on the register, you have to delimit the site. And so we're hoping to be able to go into the private area and extend the boundary to make that happen. And I'm working with Jim. I'm his co-pilot on that project.
Actually, Jana Grubbs and I are the project managers. Mary's the principal investigator for Spring Warrior. Andy Hemmings is a principal investigator for the Confederate Salt Works. And where am I going? Willett Boyer for the Wakulla sites. So anyway, we got our work cut out for us, but it's nice to be busy.
Yes, very much so. Okay, I'm sure there are a few. Do we have time for? No, we have. I'm sorry. I can talk to those of you who are here later, but thank you.